Great. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amanda Perry. I'm the Executive Director for the North American Conference on British Studies. And today we are going to be talking about Saving Europe, First World War Relief, and American Identity. And we are joined by Tammy Proctor, the author, as everyone knows, our wonderful JBS editor. And John Mitcham will be joining her in conversation. I'm just going to briefly introduce them, and then I'll turn it over to them for conversation. We'll have plenty of time for a Q&A today, it seems like. So feel free to either drop your questions directly into the chat or to go ahead and raise your Zoom hand once we open it up. So Tammy M. Proctor is the Distinguished Professor of History and Interim Director of the Harvey Peace Institute at Utah State University. She also serves as co-editor of the Journal of British Studies, and she is best known for her books Female Intelligence, Women and Espionage in the First World War, published in 2003, Civilians in a World at War, 1914 to 1918 in 2010, with Susan Grayzell, Gender and the Great War, and with Sophie de Scapdriver, An English Governess in the Great War, The Secret Brussels Diary of Mary Thorpe. Proctor is also an expert in the history of international Girl Scouting, as well as Boy Scout and Girl Guide history in Britain. Her publications on scouting include Scouting for Girls, A Century of Girl Guiding and Girl Scouting in 2009. She teaches courses on both world wars, the Holocaust, sport history, and world history. And so she'll be joined in conversation today by John Mitcham, who is Department Chair and the Albert C. Labriola Endowed Chair in the Humanities at Duquesne University. His book, Race and Imperial Defense in the British World, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2016 and was a finalist for the Templar Medal. He's currently finishing a book, The Empire Club, Imperial Politics, White Supremacy, and the Making of the British Commonwealth, under contract with OUP. John is the general editor of the journal Britain and the World. So I hope everyone will join me in welcoming Tammy and John, and we look forward to hearing about the book.
Great, thanks. Well, I just want to first say thanks for coming out on what I know is probably a busy week on a Thursday, and also to thank Amanda for setting this up and really for setting up all the book talks. The ones that I've watched are great, and I really enjoy having this opportunity. Also thanks to John, because I know he's a department head, and there's a few things going on in universities these days, so I just really appreciate him taking the time to moderate this and to have a look at the book. So we talked about how to approach this, and I thought maybe I would just say a few things about why a book that is ostensibly about American history would be appropriate for a British Studies book talk. And I think that there's a couple of things I would say. First, just in general, I didn't plan it this way, but the book is really quite relevant given what's happening in our world today. And I've had a couple people who've read it write to me and say, why does it feel like we're revisiting the 1920s? But, it certainly does seem that way to a certain extent. And some of the things that the book talks about in terms of developing international organizations, the kind of notion of what aid is, why the United States should be involved in the world. All of these questions were established really in this period, and there are many of the things that are actually under attack now. So I think that despite myself, this is kind of a relevant book just for global history. In terms of the British side, the British are really all over this. And if you read the blog that we did a couple of months ago on Broadsides, we did a series of blog posts on the presidency. Hoover got his start in London doing public service. London was a key site for really staging much of the American work that was going on. And there's an Anglo-American presence in many of these aid organizations, despite the fact that the Americans try to play that down. So I don't think there's a chapter in the book that doesn't include Britain, and it really does kind of show the ways in which Britain and the United States are vying for moral leadership in the world. So I guess that's kind of my initial case for why I think this is really about Britain as well as the United States. But with that, I'll turn it over to John, because I know he's got some questions and I'm looking forward to those.
Thanks, Tammy. And I want to apologize to everybody. I was just notified via text that we may have I'm on the 7th floor of a building and we may have a fire alarm here in a few minutes. So if that's indeed the case, I will leave you all to carry on while I evacuate. But no, this was, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. Tammy, I don't think you remember this, but because we've been on a number of panels over the years, but our first interaction was actually when I was getting ready to do my dissertation research, and I squared away an opportunity to visit the Boy Scout archives and reached out to you and for some assistance because they only gave me one day, and we had a great exchange. This was probably back in 2007 or so. So it's really I think quite meaningful for me to be a part of this today. I'm going to be very brief because I have some questions, and then I think we all probably have some questions about this book. But I do want to build a little bit on Tammy's comments about the relevance of this, not just for a book that's ostensibly about American international aid and its relationship to American identity, but actually just the opposite of that. Why this is really important for American historians, and I think it's significant that somebody who has developed a career doing primarily British but deeply transnational history surrounding international organizations or the First World War is offering a really important new interpretation of American identity. So I'm going to just maybe talk a little bit about some of these historiographical interventions in American history and its relationship to the history of empire writ large. We typically think about the post-war era as a watershed period in which the United States is supplanting Britain and Germany as a world power, that sort of dawn of the American century, if you will. And this has primarily been viewed through time through two interrelated lenses, that of sort of raw military, particularly naval power, where Britain no longer rules the seas, and then more recently that of economic power, when American finance dominates European markets, when Wall Street is beginning to replace London as the center of wealth. And we can think for the latter, we can think of Adam Tooze's book, which is, I guess, now well over a decade old, but still the most sort of prominent relative recent example of this. Tammy's book breaks new ground here, thinking about the role of humanitarianism as, quote, soft power. And this is a term as a cultural agent of world influence for the United States. And this is a term and an idea that we typically associate with the Cold War and the idea of American soft power through everything from Coca-Cola to organized athletic events to the American Aid Society. Tammy shows, though, how this has a much earlier genesis, and this alliance between private finance, so the Rockefeller Foundation, for example, plays an important part in Tammy's book, and government funding as well, was not just a purely humanitarian act. It was part of a project trying to, in the minds of these American aid agents, trying to sort of rectify the disorders of the old world and recreate it in the image of the new world. And second, I think that this, and related to this, I think the book really makes important contributions to the idea of American empire and its relationship with American identity. Until recently, American history could be at least a fairly parochial pursuit, captive to the traditional nation state analysis, and subconsciously, or in some cases pretty consciously, influenced by a narrative of American exceptionalism. And in particular, I think historians of the United States have long declined to engage critically with the idea of an American empire. Now, I do believe that has changed in the last 10 years for the better. And here we can think about the huge success, not just in the academic world, but really in sort of the wider public sphere, of books like Daniel Immerwahr's How to Hide an Empire. For many Americans, I think, sort of a jarring reminder of the relationship of American history with its own empire. Tammy's project, though, isn't about the Philippines or Guam or Cuba or dollar diplomacy in Latin America, but it's about Europe. For somebody reading this with a British studies background, the comparison, the sort of the framework of thinking about what's happening in Europe in the post-war era with American aid, with Britain's liberal imperial project in the late 19th century is really jarring. It comes across very, very, very clearly for the reader. The primary actors in this book, and there's some because this is a cultural and social history. It's in some ways a sort of history of the bottom up when thinking about aid. But the primary actors in this book, both men and women, are mostly middle class, college educated, progressives for the most part, and they show up in Europe both during and after the war, confident in their moral and cultural superiority, and they're determined to remake society along modern, scientific, efficient lines. So again, this idea that it's sort of a return of the colonial now becoming, at least as a cultural agent of change, the colonizer. And as our last chapter shows, and I think this is something I've got some questions about at the end of discussion as well. The last chapter shows they also sought to preserve European heritage and Western civilization, not specifically Polish or German or Austrian, but sort of treating Europe and the idea of Europe as a sort of wide stroke, and sought to preserve this, including bringing home art and other forms of cultural artifacts for that preservation back to the United States, sort of the public history element of this as a project of preservation. And as Tammy mentioned briefly, and she's got a great blog on this, take a look at. Hoover's a great example of this. He was, arguably the most globally oriented president in American history, not just in terms of his experience working in London that Tammy mentions, but a career that ranges from South Africa to Australia to Singapore to the Middle East. He was one of the Westerners, for example, trapped in the legation in China during the Boxer Rebellion. He assists British and American troops in sort of finding a way into the city. And he brought this colonial mindset with him to his work in Belgium and then the subsequent American Relief Administration. So all these colonial comparisons that I think are really clear to readers with a background in British studies. All that aside, these activists, these agents of aid, etc., firmly rejected any notion of American imperialism, and indeed just the opposite. Americans saw their work, their efficiency at being able to deliver this aid as the highest stage of Western civilization, different from and superior to a now sort of corrupt illiberal Europe. In other words, it was part of that definition of thinking about American identity that we are not like Europe imperial. And Tammy writes in the introduction here, despite its own expansionist history, American leaders depicted Europeans as the true imperialist and themselves as Republican internationalists, setting up an important and lasting vision for the United States and its presence overseas. American leaders reiterated this idea that Americans embraced humanitarian goals rather than imperial ones. The fantasy that the United States did not at the time possess, nor had it ever possessed, an empire relied on the peculiar notion that American freedom and democracy bequeathed a musical morality which was simply incompatible with imperialism, and this sentiment in turn infused its relief projects. I think that somebody who actually started life as an American historian, I went to graduate school to do the Civil War, and 3 or 4 days into graduate school had a fortunate change of heart. But it's somebody who was very heavily surrounded by American historiography in graduate school. I think that this is a really important intervention with American historiography to think not just about how the United States is able to hide an empire, but how imperialism in its various guises is a constituent part of the remaking of American identity in the early 20th century, and with its obvious sort of connections to transatlantic themes, particularly that of its Britishness. So great job, Tammy. One last thing I will say too about this, and then I will shut up. There's a lot of good stuff in this book. It's richly researched. It's every chapter is a different country, so it's not just looking at aid in Belgium or aid in France, but it's packaged in a really accessible and concise way. 199 pages. Tammy, I don't know if that was a goal, but it comes in right at 200 pages, which means that this is a really accessible book for anybody looking for an undergraduate monograph to use in some kind of class on 20th century internationalism, transnational history, history of American identity, whatever the case may be. And I think this is a hard medium to find in an era when we really have to be thinking much more concretely about accessibility for books. And so well done in that regard, Tammy. So I've got a couple of questions I will offer, and then we'll open it up to questions. And Tammy, my first question, and this is something that anytime I ever hear a book talk, this is always the thing that comes to my mind, but particularly because I've traced your career from my early time as a graduate student and know the sort of trajectory of thinking about your early work on the scouting movement, and then your later work on First World War and on gender and war. What brought you to this topic? What was the sort of spark that brought that what was it that sparked your interest in this particular topic? How did you come about this?
Thanks, John, and thanks for that nice introduction. And I think you might have actually said my argument better than I did, but I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And as I say in the preface, I think this is a really long process to make this book, which I think maybe was a factor in being able to create something that's more contained, because I knew that I was going to have to make decisions. I started researching this in 2004, really kind of as it was just a sideline to my book on civilians that I was doing. But to answer your question, I think a couple of things sparked this. First, I had a Fulbright in Belgium, and I think I say this in the preface as well, or maybe it's in something else that I've written. But I ran across, this square that was named after Herbert Hoover, and I just thought, well, that's peculiar. What's this about? And then right next to that square is the American Library in Leuven, which is also an American edifice. My own university at the time, Wittenberg University, had a square on the outside of the building, and it was full of like boys clubs of Detroit and universities and colleges, each of which had purchased a square, almost like these projects you see in the US where people buy bricks. And again, there was a Hoover's bust at this library. And so I started thinking, this is really odd. What actually is going on here? So that's one of the things. And I got really fascinated by Belgian history too while I was there. The second thing is that it kind of took me back to the Scouts. And I know since you've also done work that overlaps with mine, there's this sense that the Anglo-American project is a shared one, and yet there are all of these places where it's not. And that just seemed to really come out in some of the reading that I was doing for the civilians book. In particular, when I started looking at the Quakers and the ways in which they were both competing and collaborating with each other in these projects. So that also really kind of gave me a sense that I needed to do more than just one European country, that I needed to look at how American aid projects played out in other places. And then the third thing, again, is in the preface, which is that I had a seminar when I was a graduate student, which I will say almost killed me. Like, I didn't know I was going to survive the seminar, but it was co-taught by a European historian, Victoria de Grazia, and an American historian, Jackson Lears. And they actually argued in the seminar. All of the students, we didn't know quite what to do with this, but also really hard readings on cultural studies, cultural history, Frankfurt School. You can imagine with those two historians what we were reading. And I guess it's been percolating for a while, because as I was writing this book, I realized, boy, I was going back to notes that were, on spiral bound notebooks from years ago. That something in those conversations really made me think about this longer term relationship. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's really why I started doing this.
I related to that. So I'm finishing this finally, knock on wood. Finishing
I'm
my
waiting for it.
yeah, and I'm actually next week giving the first talk in what I think will be a third book project, and I'm finding that the intellectual leap between writing the second book nearly killed me in a way that the first book did not, but thinking about a third book is in some ways much more liberating, and yet much more, it's a scarier process for me, in part because I'm so sufficiently sick of the types of things I've been talking about for 15 years.
Right.
I'm moving in a very, very different direction. And so one of the things that, as I was reading your book, was one of the things that kept coming back in my mind was, and you partially answered this by saying that this actually has its genesis quite a long time ago. But for many sort of mid-career people who are at this stage and thinking about moving in a very, fundamentally different direction, particularly with a lot of the uncertainties about the state of the humanities, funding, things of this nature. Was this something, was moving in a more American history oriented direction something that you found liberating, or was it something that really required you to adopt a new, not necessarily methodology, but sort of rethink a lot of the skills and ideas that you've accumulated in your career to sort of strike out in new territory, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that really, um, starting with the civilians book, I had already started moving in that direction. So in 2010, um, and uh, so as a graduate student, one of my areas was a comparative women's history field, and it was American European. So I wasn't unfamiliar entirely with American history, but again, this has been many years ago, and I started going to Schaefer to their, some of their conferences, reading a lot more diplomatic history, talking to American historians, having American historians read this. So I don't know if Vince is here, but Vince DiGirolamo, who's an American historian, read the whole manuscript and gave me, like, saved me a few in a few places. So I really appreciate that. Um, but I also just kept thinking that I'm really writing a European history. What I'm doing is placing Americans into that European stage. Because much of what I was hoping to do was show the ways in which Europeans were actors in this story. In fact, they're central to aid. You can't deliver aid without Europeans. That they are the people on the ground doing the work. But the American story of that aid almost erases them. And so part of what I was trying to do was really kind of look at American history through the lens of somebody who really studies European history, if that makes sense.
Uh, there's a lot of rich anecdotes in this book. Some of them, quite dramatic and dealing with particularly famine and issues of, uh, many of these organizations, and Germany in particular was fascinating. This is, reluctance on the part of American society to either fund federal mandates for aid to Germany or even private donations. And so Tammy's work really does a nice job of talking about the ways that aid organizations are able to frame assistance to Germany in a humanitarian way that makes it clear this is not necessarily going to be feeding former now demobilized German soldiers. And one of the ways they do this is through famine efforts aimed at children. And there was one anecdote that really stood out to me, that the bread lines and children under the age of 15 could show up and get bread, but because administrators were so concerned that this bread would end up on the black market, they would make the children ideally eat the bread there, but if not, at least take a big bite out of it. And in some cases, their stomachs were now sort of so shrunk that they could not actually eat an entire loaf or a roll of bread, and so they taking the bite out of it. And this was I read the book weeks ago, and this is the one anecdote that stands out in my mind as something. So I'm curious, as you're going through the research, and a lot of this is based on reports and memoirs and other press accounts of this. Is there a particular moment or a particular episode in this entire story, which is again very transnational, that is the one that really stands out to you in your memory of looking back through this research?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's probably a number of moments, but since you gave one that's really kind of heartrending, which is these poor kids, who are being forced to take a bite of bread so that they don't take it home to their families, and or sell it. There were a lot of just really heartbreaking stories. But I'll tell a more lighthearted one, which I think also gets to some of uh, the eccentricity, I guess, of these relief efforts as well, which is Gertrude Kemmerer, who Kimmerer, Wyoming, which is just down the road from me, is named after her family. She starts almost like a one-woman project. She gets money from other wealthy donors in the US to re-rabbit France. And again, a little eccentric, but her idea is that if they could bring in rabbits from the United States, then people who are, trying to recover from war could raise these rabbits. And it reminds me of the Michael Moore documentary, for pets or meat, either one. And so she sets up these projects, and the rabbits become wards of the cities where they are. They're like officially wards of the state, and people can come and ask for a rabbit, and then they can raise the rabbit for meat, for comfort, whatever you want. So and it's kind of, as I said, a very odd, eccentric thing, but it was not unusual for people to have just private projects. And many Americans had much more money than they knew what to do with. And this is while the United States was still neutral in many cases. They just went and started these projects, which is partly why by the time the US enters the war, they have to start regulating charitable organizations, because there were really tens of thousands of projects and no regulation whatsoever. So the scams were also just everywhere. But that one always sticks out to me as just a good example of sort of American hubris, I guess.
One of the elements of this, particularly with the Anglo-American dimension, that both surprised me as well as I realized I had no idea that the degree of both cooperation but also competition that existed between the British and American organizations, but particularly those that were either run by or heavily staffed by Quakers. And so one of the themes that really comes across is the importance of the Society of Friends on, again, both sides of the Atlantic as catalysts and movers for these organizations. Could you talk a little bit more about some of this, both cooperation as well as competition, which is in some ways kind of reflective of the awkward Anglo-American embrace after the war anyway, but particularly looking at this through the lens of Quakers?
Yeah, and I think it's kind of a microcosm for the larger relationship between the United States and Britain, because in 1914, the Society of Friends in London immediately sends a group to France to start a relief project. And so by the time that the US American Friends Service Committee is founded, which is in 1917, and many more Americans start going to do this relief, they are mostly going to embed in existing British units. So they're the newbies, they go in and they're under the tutelage of the British in 1917. They are not running the show. That actually flips after the war, partly because the funding, much of the funding is in the United States. And they're getting American Red Cross money, but also the Quakers themselves are raising a lot. And you can see in the Quaker relationship at the national levels, so at the London and the Philadelphia offices, you can actually see the power shift. You can see it move. Austria is the place where they're fighting it out. So there's an Austrian head of mission, Hilda Clark. A lot of Americans, they fight, they complain, they have trouble working together. And so when they start the work in Germany, which is after Austria, they deliberately create almost an entirely American mission. There's one British friend in that mission, and the British set up their own section in Essen, because they've decided that they need to part ways a little bit. Now, it's not always true. So in Poland, in the Soviet Union, in those famine relief, the Quakers cooperate again, but it's never an easy relationship. And both sides of the Atlantic, I went to both Quaker archives, and you really can see the tensions that are developing. And a lot of them are about nationalism. They're about, what the identity is, but they're also about what it means to be a friend. And the British are much more oh, I don't know, some of them smoke, some of them, are socialists. They're have a sort of different character than, say, a Midwestern Quaker coming from Richmond, Indiana, who is somewhat appalled. I mean, they swear. There's just this really different cultural sense, despite the fact that they hold many of the same religious beliefs. So I found the Quakers a nice through line for many of the chapters. They're not in Belgium. They really don't operate in Belgium because it was occupied territory, but they're really in every other chapter, I think, to some extent, because they do provide a nice way to tell this story. And also, I feel like they need more attention.
Well, I have a lot more questions, but I do want to open it up. So maybe there's enough people that if you just raise your hand and I'll try and moderate and call on you. Or I guess technically I put it in the group chat as well. Amy, I did have I'm by no means a expert on the history of humanitarianism, but my understanding of it is that this is a field that has been quite lively of late, particularly in this area, but it's been in sort of two different, not necessarily opposing camps, but perspectives. The one is thinking about the sort of like the dark origins, the kind of unanticipated or in some cases quite anticipated consequences of humanitarianism, and often very heavily rooted in a colonial context. I'm thinking of J.P. Dalton's work on the Congo, and at a more popular element, even something like Adam Hochschild's book about King Leopold's ghost. And then the other side of this is thinking about humanitarianism through a very transnational and transnational organizations as well. And my graduate students a year or so ago read Bruno Cabanes' really cool book on the Great War and the origins of humanitarianism, which in some ways, I can see maybe some of the influence of that on your book and thinking about individual agency and thinking about transnational connections. But between these sort of two lines of historiography on humanitarianism in the modern period, I'm curious how you see your book fitting into that literature.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Bruno's book is probably the one that's closest in terms of just trying to do a series of cases to talk about this moment. And of course, it's the exact same timing as my book. The other place where there's been a lot of books coming out are actually national studies of these various aid efforts. So just in the last couple of years, there have been fantastic new books on Hungary, on France, on Austria, that are national studies of how aid plays out in the same period. And so those were really helpful to me. And I feel like mine is, in a sense, kind of pulling in a smattering of those perspectives into one volume. I think the other thing I was hoping to do was really introduce Americans, especially, to these various interventions in Europe. So the way it's structured, each chapter has a kind of why this country section. So why Belgium, why Poland, which gives a little canned history of, what's happening in 1918, 1919 in this country as a setup for the aid. And I really did have in mind, my own students and being able to introduce them to these stories that I think, especially the ones in Eastern Europe, have really fallen away. There's a gap in a lot of the work on the 1920s, and so that's where I hope that the book's making a contribution. I've had some people ask me why 1924 is the end, and so I also tried to address that in the book. It's when a lot of the aid organizations pull out. It's 10 years after the beginning of the war. But as I think I suggest in chapter 6, it's also a moment in American history that's super important. The Immigration Act of 1924, Indian Citizenship Acts at the same year. The creation of the US Border Patrol is 1924. So at the same time that Americans are retelling the story of Europe through the new Western civilization courses that are introduced in 1919, they're also kind of simultaneously in the world and closing their borders. So there's this redefinition of what it means to be an American. And that for me was really super cool, I guess, to think about how those things come together, because I'd always wondered why 1924, like what's going on? And I do think that a lot of the American intervention in the world after World War I, not military intervention, but these other kinds of ways of being in the world, help create some of what's happening. And I tell a story of one of the workers in Poland who goes as part of the YWCA's Grey Samaritans project, who's actually barred entry when she tries to come back because in the meantime the immigration laws changed. And so you see that some of these workers who are trying to show their American credentials through these aid projects, and this is particularly true in Poland of some of the Polish American Catholics, but also the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. They come back to a very different United States than what they left when they went to do aid. And so I find that less work has been done on this, 1920 to 25 period than I would like to see, I guess.
I think you realized when you started working on this that it would be so timely when you
No.
so.
No, and I think we're going to put the blog post in the follow-up, but I did write a blog for OUP about this, which is just called The End of the American Century ? Because really, when the book came out, I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't really realize that this was going to be like that we were going to have tariffs again and rejection of international organizations, and like we really are revisiting the 1920s.
Nadia, you have a question?
Hi, Tammy.
Hi, Nadia.
I actually have two questions for you. One is that yesterday I was teaching Nick Cullither's The Hungry World to my grad students. And if some of you don't know that book, it's really about the Green Revolution and US foreign aid and humanitarianism and development. And he argues, as you know, in that book, that basically colonial subjects become developmental subjects in the 20th century. But it seemed to me that your story is actually part of his story. Like it's a prehistory of the food part, at least the food aid part is a prehistory of that story. And so I'm wondering if that actually that language of development, which we see, the British using clearly by the interwar period, the Americans using in this, post-World War II period, do we ever see in your story a language that might be actually a language of redevelopment of Europe being used sort of alongside humanitarianism or aid as a kind of language? So that's one question. So I'll let you answer that first, and then I have another.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. And yes, and I actually use Nick's book in mine because his work on the calorie is really helpful for me too. Yeah. So as is your work on food. So I'll just give a shout out there. But I think so a couple of answers to that. One, development's all over this, and particularly in countries that there is a sense from the aid workers, both British and American, that they need developing. So not so much in France. France is about reconstruction. They talk about reconstruction, even though they're doing things like introducing California architecture in the reconstruction and stuff, like weird stuff. But they don't think France needs it so much. But Poland needs development, right? And that comes out very clearly. And so definitely there's a language of that. And in some cases, a redevelopment, especially in Austria, we need to bring them back to the glory that they had. And we have to do this. The second part of this is that many of the people, I mean, you can just trace their lineage. Many of the people involved in these projects become the first or second, in some cases, heads of UN development organizations later. So they're very young here. Many of them are in their 20s, and they become crucial to the development of development regimes later on. They basically reinvent themselves as relief experts, that then become development experts. And so, you know, both of those are playing a role here. And I think in the conclusion, I do a little thing with Paul Farmer, some of the way he describes the work he's doing, and line it up with Hoover and how he's describing it. And it's really kind of eerie how much overlap there is just in the language that they're using about development. And then the third like little short thing about this is I just did an article for Quaker Studies last year, I think, that's called I forget what it's called, but it's something like the end of relief question mark. And the whole article is about how do you know when to stop? And the problem is that many of the people get very invested in the work that they're doing, and they want to fix long-term problems. So when does war relief turn into progressivism, basically? How do we, you know, when are you just trying to end poverty? And that becomes development work. So that article really kind of, because I had the same question when I finished the book, and actually I think you read the article, Nadia, but it really does speak to that question of like, when does relief end and development starts?
Yeah, that's really interesting. My other quick question actually is a question about continuity. So the story of the eating the bread in front of the aid worker, I was like, oh wow, that's what they did for children during the Indian famines of the 19th century, made them eat their food there. But then they also did that with school lunches in the 1930s in Britain. You couldn't take any of the food home to your family. And so in some ways we think of, you know, the First World War as this kind of rupture moment, but in other ways, this is a kind of continuity that the strategies of aid actually, or the ideologies of aid and how it is to be received, not just given, but received, really, there's a kind of continuity here that we see stretching back to the Victorian period, but also forward later into the 20th century. So I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, about this not being a rupture.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not sure I do as good a job in the book as I could have on that issue. I do talk a little bit about some of the earlier famine work, and there's of course been some great books done on the 19th century and these projects. But yeah, especially, and this is again where progressivism comes in, I think, that some of the oh, you know, the lady visitors, the attempts to remake the poor from the 19th century, the famine relief projects, the imperial relief projects, all of those play into this notion that there are groups of people who can't be trusted with the food, you know, and everybody knows that the children are going to take the food home to their families, right? Of course they are. And so there is a kind of policing of the food distribution that is really disturbing to read. And I do think it's a continuity that you see even really today in some of the programs, you know, for feeding the poor. But yeah, the other thing about that, and you've also talked about this in some of your work, is the measuring, the cruelty of the measuring of children. And you know, if they got too fat, you know, if they actually ate enough to get better, their food was cut off. So imagine that, just the agony of going to be measured and not knowing whether you were going to be able to be fed the next day or not. I mean, it's just really, I don't know how the aid workers dealt with that. That must have just been awful.
Any other questions?
Tammy, I have a question about Herbert Hoover.
Oh, hi, Carol.
Hi, Tammy. Since you started, you said the project started with Hoover and he's part of the book. For those of us who don't know much about Hoover, except for the bad part, is this in some way a rehabilitation of Hoover?
Well, I don't want to be responsible for rehabilitating Hoover, so I just want to make that clear.
Maybe
But
that's
yes,
too broad, but
yes,
maybe
in a
it gives us,
sense,
yeah.
yeah.
Does it
I
at
would,
least give us a positive view?
yeah, I would say that what it is it's a backstory to what Americans think they know about Hoover. So, most of us were really raised on the bonus army. We were raised on the Depression and nothing else. The tariffs, that actually I think he actually opposed, but Congress pushed through. Um, and so what I want to say is that the story is a lot more complicated than that. And I had kind of come to see Hoover a little differently even before this. So there's even a backstory to the backstory, which is that when I was working on the Girl Scouts, Lou Henry Hoover, who's a fascinating figure, his wife, was president of the Girl Scout Association in the US and a long-term Girl Scout. And looking at her letters, I got kind of a sense of Hoover in a different frame even before I started doing this. So in the back of my mind was always, what's his deal? Um, and I really don't know what in the end result is of his life and career. He is a hero in many communities in Europe in the 1920s. One of the main squares in Warsaw was destroyed in the Second World War, but there was a statue to him in Warsaw. When you go to the Hoover Institution or to the Presidential Library, it's filled with letters of gratitude, with artworks, with visits. People saw him as the face of this American aid in the 20s, which he loved. So, there's a certain amount of ego in this as well. But on the flip side, and I don't really talk about it that much in the book, he's also, at the same time he's running these aid projects, or at least the ends of them, he's the director, or he's the Secretary of Commerce for the United States. So nothing is really straightforward. I think he genuinely believed that the United States didn't make war on children, which is one of his speeches that he made. He genuinely believed that people in Europe had a right to food and to clothing and to safety. But he also thought that this was the best way to stop Bolshevism, and that it would be good for United States business. He also was in control of the grain in the United States. He was head of the U.S. Grain Corporation. So it is, again, not there is an interest here in getting that grain to mouths. And so, there's a lot of behind the scenes moving of money. So yeah, he's just an interesting person. I kind of hope that what it'll do is create more interest in digging up some of his life. I mean, I think John mentioned the Boxer Rebellion. That some of that stuff is really fascinating as well. His time in Australia and in South Africa, his fights with the other mining engineers in those areas. I mean, there's just a lot of really good stuff, and I think that it's been something that, because of his reputation during the Depression, has been understudied. And his deep ties to London. I mean, he lived there. He was almost disqualified for he thought about running for president in 1920, and there was a huge campaign against him because he didn't live in the U.S., or at least that's how it was portrayed, right? He lives in London. He's not one of us. So anyway, sorry, I'll stop rambling.
The questions.
Again, I'm grateful for people who came out. I know if your calendar looks like mine, this is a busy time of the semester, so. It's good to see Ruby.
Yeah, sorry, Tammy. I want to keep my video on because I know that so many are often off and students keep stopping by and they're all a little panicky about midterms, so I don't feel like I can shut the door. But this is great. Thank you.
Thanks.
I've been thinking about your book the past few weeks because everyone I know in Britain said that their news has been around the clock, is America abandoning Europe?
Yep.
And that has really dominated their news. And I I feel like, of course, that's part of our news cycle, but it seems to have been at least a solid week of pretty much all of their news cycle. And so I kept thinking about your book. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking about it in one of the, I don't know, one of the things from our president that came out, but about gratitude, like they just aren't grateful for everything we've done for them. And that is so much a part of the story that I'm telling. The fact that a century later, we're still demanding gratitude for, whatever it is that the United States did is really, it does make me wonder about the power of these narratives, the staying power of them. But should we release everyone to their duties?
Sure, I feel like we'll let everyone get back to their busy lives. I want to thank you, Tammy, so much for talking about the book today. Again, like Ruby, right? It's been on top of my mind too, with everything that's happening in the aid world as well, and thinking about those things. So it's been super interesting to hear. Thank you, John, also for joining us in conversation, for your wonderful commentary.
Thanks, John. Yeah.
I hope that we'll see some of you folks at some of our other book talks. You can check on our website. But in the meanwhile, can you all please help me in thanking Tammy for a wonderful talk today?
Thank you.
Thanks so much.